Hi, everyone. Um, Earlier this year in P3, we read Wildwood by Colin Meloy in class. And now we're going to start Under Wildwood, which is the second book in the trilogy, also by Colin Meloy. I have this book on Kindle, so I'll be reading off my computer. If we take a look at our table of contents, it looks like in part 1, there are 8 chapters. Part 2 is chapters 9 through 16. Part 3 is chapters 17 through 25. So 3 parts in this book. There's also a map you can look up on Google. I'll be sure to post it on Google Classroom. Trying to find the first part. All right. Part 1. Chapter 1. A boy and his rat. Snow is falling. Snow as white as a swan's feather, white as a trillium bloom. The whiteness is nearly blinding against the dark green and brown of the surrounding forest, and it lies in downy heaps beneath the quiet, dormant clutches of ivy and blackberry bushes. It is heaped against the bases of the tall fir trees, and it carpets the little trenches in the shallows around the wide cedar roots. A road carves its way through the deep forest. It, too, is covered in an untouched shroud of snow. In fact, if you didn't know there was a road beneath the snow, if you didn't know there were centuries of footsteps and hoofbeats and miles of weathered flagstones beneath the snow, you might just think it was a fallow stretch of woods, somehow left untouched by the forest's teeming greenery. There are no wheel tracks, no tire treads on this road. No footprints mar the delicate white of the snow. You might think it was a game trail, a stretch of ground where no tree could take root because of the constant traffic of silent walkers, deer, elk, and bear. But even here, in this most removed area from the world, there are no animal tracks. The more the snow falls, the more the road disappears. It is becoming just another part of this vast, unending forest. Listen. The road is quiet. Listen. A distant clatter suddenly disrupts this placid stillness. It is the sound of wagon wheels and the whinnying of a horse pushed to the limit of its strength. The horse's hooves beat a mad rhythm against the earth, a rhythm dulled by the mute of the snow. Look. Around a bend comes flying a carriage, 2 of its 4 wheels lifting from the ground momentarily to make the turn. 2 sweat-slick black horses are harnessed to the coach, and plumes of steam blow from their nostrils like smoke belching from a chimney. Perched above the horses is the coachman, a large man piled in black wool and a tattered top hat. He barks gruffly at the horses at their every stride, shouting, "Yap!" and "Faster! On!" He spares no strike of the whip. There is a look of deep consternation on his face. He spends the brief moments between the snaps of his whip, eyeing the surrounding forest warily. Look closer. Below him, in the simple black carriage itself, sits a woman, alone. She is dressed in a fine silk gown, and her face is covered in a shimmering pink veil. Rings, studded with bright jewels, glint on her fingers. In her hands, she holds a delicate paper fan which she opens and closes nervously. She too watches the flanking walls of trees surrounding the carriage, as if looking for someone or something within them. Opposite her sits an ornate chest, its sides decorated with gold and silver filigree. A lock holds the chest twin straps closed, the key to which hangs at the woman's throat by a thin golden cord. Antsy, she raps at the ceiling of the carriage with the fan. The driver hears the rapping and spurs the horses on, raining even more blows from his whips raining even more blows from his whip down on their heaving flanks. A sudden flash of movement on the road ahead catches the driver's attention. He squints his eyes against the blinding white of the falling snow. A boy is standing in the middle of the road. But this is no ordinary boy. This boy is dressed in what appears to be an elegantly brocaded officer's coat, like some infantryman from the Crimean War. His hair is black and curly and sprouts from beneath the coarse fur of an ushanka hat. He is idly swinging an emptied sling. There is a rat on his shoulder. "Stop!" says the boy. "This is a stick-up." "You heard him!" shouts the rat. "Rein it in, fatso!" The coachman hisses a curse under his breath. With a quick turn of his wrist, he has dropped the whip and has taken the reins in both of his hands. He snaps them eagerly, and the horses lean into their gallop. A cruel smile has appeared on the coachman's face. "Hya!" he shouts to the beleaguered horses. The boy's face, formerly buoyed with confidence, falls. He swallowed hard. "I'm serious," he stammers. The coachman's cracked lips have pulled back to reveal an astonishing row of yellow teeth. He is not slowing. The lady in the carriage gives a slight shriek as it careens along the snowy road. The boy quickly reaches down and pulls a rock from the ground. He wipes it clean of snow on his trousers and sets it into the cradle of his sling. "Don't make me do this," he warns. It's not clear whether the coachman hears this. He is barreling toward the boy and the rat at an alarming rate. With a casual expertise, he's evidently been practicing, the boy lets loose the stone from the sling and it flies toward the coachman, who ducks just in time. The stone sails over his head to fall into the deep, snowy bracken of the forest. The boy does not have time to pick up another. The coach is so close that the boy can smell the sweat coming off the horses. The rat gives a little "oh" and dives into the gully at the side of the road. The boy follows him and they tumble into a pile together. The carriage roars by. The horses, spooked at having so nearly missed hitting the two brigands, whinny noisily as they pass. The veiled woman in the carriage clutches at the key at her throat. She gives a high-pitched warble of fear. The coachman, somewhat chuffed at his bravado, throws a look over his shoulder at the boy and his rat. "Better luck next time, suckers!" he shouts. His attention thus diverted, he does not see the cedar trunks as they fall, domino-like, in a crash of splinters to block the road ahead. 3 of them. One after another. Bam! 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 The woman screams. The coachman swings his head to face forward and gives the reins a violent yank. The horses yelp. Their hooves scramble desperately against the slick surface of the road. The carriage tips and shimmies and emits a shuddering groan. Thinking quickly, the driver hollers an impassioned "Hya!" and deftly navigates the horses and carriage through the obstacle course of the fallen trees. Bodies, male and female, are appearing from the woods. They are dressed similarly to the boy, but their uniforms are mismatched. Some wear tattered shirts. Some have bandanas covering their faces. They are all children. The oldest might be 15. They are staring with disbelief at the coachman's ability to thread the cumbersome carriage with its 2 panicked horses through their trap. Within moments, the coachman has cleared the obstacles and has returned to his whip, urging the horses on. In the meantime, the boy and the rat have picked themselves up from the roadside ditch and have brushed the clinging snow from their clothes. The rat leaps back up to the boy's shoulder as the boy puts his fingers to his lips and gives a shrill whistle. From the dense scrub of the forest comes a horse, a dappled brown and white pony. The boy throws himself astride the horse, the rat holding tight to the boy's epaulette, and kicks it into a gallop. Arriving at the fallen trees, he leaps the horse and clears the 3 cedars. A spray of snow and mud flies up when the horse makes landfall. The children in the woods have shaken themselves from their shock and are calling their mounts. Soon the road is filled with galloping riders giving chase to the fleeing carriage. The coachman ahead marks this. He curses the bandits' temerity. The wind is lashing at his face. The snow is now driving, icy. Of the pursuing riders, the boy with the rat is clearly among the fastest. Many are unable to keep up the pace that the carriage is setting and fall away. Within minutes, only 4 remain. The boy, another older boy, and 2 girls. They draw closer to the speeding carriage and split apart, 2 on each side of the vehicle. The rat, holding tight to the boy's shoulder by a flap of his furry hat, issues a warning to the coachman. "Give up your gold," he shouts, "and you can go free." The coachman responds with a hair-raising curse that makes the boy blush even in this most hectic of moments. He is now level with the carriage. He can see inside. The veiled woman, the key at her neck, the clasped ornate chest. The woman watches him curiously, her large brown eyes glinting from above the shimmering cloth at her face. The boy is momentarily distracted by the scene. The rat shouts, "Look out!" In an effort to unseat his pursuers, the coachman has feinted the carriage to the left, and the boy nearly runs his pony directly into the coach's traces. He catches a shriek in his throat and veers the pony off the road. The pony's hooves hit the soft underbrush of the roadside and it falters. The ground drops away here and slopes down to a rushing brook far below. The boy braces for the fall, but the pony is nimble. In a flash, the boy's steed has righted itself and finds its footing again on the road. The boy whispers a word of thanks in its ear. They are back on the chase. The carriage leads them now by several horse lengths. The 3 other bandits are struggling to keep up. One of the riders, a girl with straw blonde hair, has grabbed hold of the roof of the One of the riders, a girl with straw blonde hair, has grabbed hold of the roof of the coach and is attempting to climb aboard. It's a risky ploy. The girl's face is set in concentration. The other 2 bandits, a boy and a girl, have managed to spur their mounts to ride parallel to the coach's horses. The blonde-haired girl grunts loudly and vaults from her horse. She barely manages to grab hold of the latticework that runs along the top of the carriage. Her horse veers away. Her body swings against the carriage side, eliciting another high-pitched scream from its passenger. The girl steadies herself and climbs to the top of the carriage, giving a triumphant whoop. She turns her head to the boy with the rat, who is still several horse lengths behind. "May the best bandit," she begins. Her sentence is cut short when the carriage plows underneath a low-hanging bough and the girl is lifted from her perch in the blink of an eye. The boy with the rat must duck to avoid the girl's dangling feet as he gallops his pony toward the carriage. "Win!" finishes the girl, suspended from the limb of the tree. The boy nods to the rat and grits his teeth in determination. There is now only he and the other girl. The other boy has fallen away from the chase, his mount limping into the underbrush. "Aisling!" the boy shouts. "Get the horses!" The girl, now parallel with the right-hand horse, has heard him. She is trying to get her hands on the horse's bridle, but the coachman's whip is foiling her every attempt. "Away, vile brigand!" shouts the coachman. The girl winces as the whip's leather tip leaves a red welt on the back of her hand. "Septimus!" hisses the boy to the rat. "Think you can help out?" The rat smiles. "I think I could do a little something." The boy is now even with the carriage. He can hear the mewing of the maiden within. The rat leaps from the boy's shoulder and lands on the nape of the coachman, who lets out a blood-curdling scream. "Rats!" he shouts. "I can't stand rats!" But the rodent has already crawled down the coachman's shirt and is busy practicing a kind of Irish step dance between his naked shoulder blades. The coachman hollers and lets fall both the whip and the reins. The coach's horses, confused, lose their gallop, and the boy and the girl are able to pull up even with them. With a quick glance at each other, the two bandits leap astride the carriage horses and pull them to a scrambling stop. The coachman jumps from his seat and stumbles away down the road, his hands desperately clawing at his back. The girl and the boy watch him, laughing, before turning to the task at hand. The girl beckons graciously. "After you." The boy bows and walks towards the idle carriage, radiating confidence. He swings the door open. Now, ma'am, he says proudly, "if you wouldn't mind turning over—" His words falter. Inside, the woman has removed her veil to relieve... Sorry. His words falter. Inside, the woman has removed her veil to reveal a shocking, tangled nest of auburn facial hair. Also, there is the barrel of a flintlock pistol pointing at him. "I don't think so," says the passenger in a husky and very unladylike baritone. The boy is crestfallen, but he begins. "Bang," says the passenger. He gives the boy a scolding rap on his forehead with the pistol barrel. The boy stares and scratches at his temple as if replaying the entire scene in his mind. He kicks his boots in the snow. The winter term of bandit training has begun, and Curtis has just failed his first test. In what might seem like another world from the one in which this scene was just playing out, but in fact was only a handful of miles distant, Prue was staring out of a second-floor window, watching the snow fall and disintegrate against the lawn of George Middle School. Typical Portland winter, she thought, falling slush. With every dropping clump, she felt her chin bore farther into the palm of her hand. A couple walking along the sidewalk gingerly avoided the gathering puddles along their way, their coat lapels folded up to cover their exposed necks. Cars, dusted with a layer of brackish gray snow, splashed rooster tails of icy waters from potholes as they swished along the wet streets. It looked positively miserable out. "Prue?" The voice sounded in Prue's mind like someone calling to her over a vast distance. A lighthouse keeper hailing a ship in a gale. She chose to ignore it. "Prue McKeel?" It came again. It was sounding closer, more present. A master of ceremonies beckoning the star performer to the stage. She began to lift her chin from her palm. "Earth to Prue McKeel?" This time an explosion of laughter followed the voice. The noise abruptly brought Prue back to her present circumstances. She swiveled upright in her chair and she scanned the room. Life science, third period. The entire class was staring at her, pointing and laughing. Prue felt her face go deep red. "Sorry," she managed. "I was distracted." Ms. Darla Thenis, olive skin, floral dashiki, stared on from behind a lectern at the front of the room. She adjusted her wire rim glasses and smoothed her crow-black hair. She then silenced the class with a wave of her hand. "Your project, Prue?" The following images flashed in quick succession through her mind. Her mother digging a canning jar from the top cupboard, Prue shoving a leftover piece of baguette into the jar and setting it on the windowsill, her father mentioning it that morning that he'd gone ahead and throw away a jar full of disgusting mold-covered bread, and why on earth would there be a jar full of mold just laying around? "My dad," began Prue. "My dad threw it away." More snickers erupted from the class. Ms. Dennis peered at Prue from above her glasses. "Uncool, Prue," she said. "Deeply uncool." "I'll let him know that," replied Prue. Her teacher studied Prue for a moment, clearly trying to gauge whether the response was meant as some kind of slight. Ms. Dennis was new this quarter. Mrs. Estevez, the class's normal teacher, had unexpectedly resigned, citing health issues. Darla Dennis was from Eugene and clearly prided herself on being cool, being at the kids' level. She never failed to remind the students that she loved pop music. She made strange growling sounds every time the principal, Mr. Bream, left the room and walked the halls engulfed in a dense cloud of patchouli. She pushed her glasses back up the bridge of her nose and scanned the classroom. "Bethany," Miss Dennis asked, "I don't suppose you'd be ready to exhibit your project, considering that Miss McKeel's father has made it impossible for her to exhibit her own?" Bethany Bruxton, relishing the moment, shot a condescending glance at Prue before standing to attention. "Yes, Miss Dennis," she replied. "Please," corrected the teacher, "it's Darla." Bethany smiled shyly and said, "Darla?" "If you wouldn't mind, then." Darla Dennis waved the student to the front of the room. Tugging at the hem of her black turtleneck, Bethany walked to the far side of the classroom where a long table held a variety of students' projects. Opening the door of a lamp-lit greenhouse, Bethany removed a tall, flourishing tomato plant and walked it to the front of the class. "This semester, I'm working on grafting," she said, cradling the plant in her arms. "The idea is to create a more disease-resistant plant, and one that will produce totally delicious tomatoes." Ugh, thought Prue, what a show-off. They'd been class partners the fall semester, and Bethany had gone out of her way to sideline Prue in all their experiments. She'd taken full credit for the leaf collage they'd made, even though Prue had collected all the ochre-looking oak leaves herself. Ms. Dennis nodded along with Bethany's speech. "Rad," said Darla Dennis. Prue glared. "Thanks, Darla, and I'm happy to report that it's doing really well," Bethany continued, "and the graft seems to be taking. And while there's no fruit to report as yet, I'll expect in a couple of weeks we'll start to see a few nice blooms." "Very cool," prompted Darla, inviting the class to join in. The 7th graders in 3rd period life science murmured a collective but decidedly unenthusiastic "ooh" at their teacher's behest. Prue stayed silent. She was listening. The tomato plant was issuing a low, angry hum. Prue scanned the room to see if anyone else heard this. Everyone else was staring listlessly at Bethany. The hum was getting louder. It quavered as it hitched upward in volume. As it grew, it became clear that it was a hum of discomfort and frustration. "Sorry," thought Prue, directing her thoughts to the plant. She could certainly sympathize. It wasn't even the plant's proper season, and here it was, being grown inside a science class hothouse. And she couldn't imagine having had a fellow tomato plant's limb grafted onto your stalk. It was positively barbaric. The tomato plant seemed to heave a sigh. Prue had an idea. You know what would be funny? She thought. Rumph, hummed the tomato plant. Prue laid it out. Suddenly, Bethany flinched her head backward, crinkling her nose. The students gasped. It had appeared for a split second that the top leaf of the tomato plant had actually slapped Bethany in the nose. It was evident that Miss Dennis had not seen it. She shot a glare over the classroom. Now, kids, come on. Gasp. The classroom heaved again. It had happened once more. The topmost limb of the small green tomato plant had fainted upward and undeniably given its holder another swift swat across the nose. A look of bewildered terror had spread across Bethany's face, and she began holding the plant at arm's length. Following the student's gaze, a very confused Miss Dennis turned to watch Bethany as she inched toward the little greenhouse. Maybe it needs a little more time, managed Bethany, her face grown perfectly pale. She gingerly placed the plant back in the glass confines of the greenhouse and backed away. It was totally healthy this morning. A low, satisfied whistle had replaced the tomato plant's unhappy hum. Miss Dennis's eyes swiveled over to Prue. She stared at her with shock and disbelief. Prue smiled and returned her gaze to the window, to the falling slush beyond the glass, and to the gathering puddles in the rain-swept streets. From the desk of Lee Bream, Principal, George Middle School. Date 2/15. Anne and Lincoln McKeel, parents of Prue McKeel. Dear Mr. and Mrs. McKeel, since your daughter's admission to this school last year, she has proved herself to be a bright and independent thinker. Her promise was judged to be very great. It saddens me, however, to report that this promise had been somewhat clouded of late. Since the beginning of last term, her grades have fallen precipitously, and her behavior in class has been reported as being, across the board, uncharacteristic. She has shown little of her former interest in her schoolwork and has taken to exhibiting a very unbecoming attitude to her teachers. The bearer of this note, Miss Darla Tennis, has kindly volunteered to speak to you on this subject, and we hope that her involvement can lead to a happy resolution. We understand that the crisis your family underwent earlier in this school year, the disappearance of your young son, must have been incredibly difficult. We are aware of the effect that such trauma can have on the minds of our children. However, we would wish to get to the bottom of any unfortunate backsliding and nip the problem in the bud, lest it should become insurmountable and lead to a promising student being suspended or worse, expelled. Sincerely, Lee Bream, Principal, George Middle School. Prue lowered the letter from her eyes, allowing the faces of the three adults in the kitchen to rise over the page like the orbiting moons of some distant planet. The room was silent, save for the regular sproing coming from Prue's little brother Mac's door-jamb-mounted bouncing chair. She shrugged. I don't know what you want me to say, she offered, sprawling. Her mother and father shared a concerned glance. Hun, said her mother, perhaps you should, sprawling. Prue's dad looked away from his wife to the dashikid teacher, the third of this celestial triumvirate. Triumvirate? She was leaning against the refrigerator. Ms. began Prue's dad, sprawling. Please, said the teacher, her gaze transfixed on the little boy in the bouncing chair. Call me Darla. She seemed to be waiting for the next loud sprawling. Darla, continued Prue's dad, I have to say this comes as a complete shock to us. I mean, sprawling. It has been a difficult few months for sure, but we feel like this is inevitable considering the kind of sproing craziness that we'd been through all at the beginning of the year. And sproing, he paused, noticing that Darla's attention was being forcibly diverted to the bouncing child in the baby seat with every contraction of the seat's spring. Sweetheart, he said finally to his wife, would you mind taking Mac out of that thing for a second? Once Mac had been removed from the bouncing chair and Prue's mother had returned to the kitchen, the discussion recommenced. Darla Dennis. Listen, I know what you're going through. This is all very normal for a child of her age. We just don't want her to fall too far behind. Prue remained silent. She studied the three adults intently. They were talking about her as if she wasn't even in the room. It made her all the more disinclined to include herself. She kicked her wellies against the cork-tiled floor and attempted to imagine the three interrogators away. She envisioned an earthquake sending a jagged crack through the middle of the kitchen, consuming the adults in one swift tremor. Darla evidently caught on to Prue's disconnectedness and began speaking directly to her. Hun, your final exams last semester were dismal. It's like you're not even there in class, like your head is just somewhere else, in some faraway place. It is, thought Prue. And don't even get me started on your absences, said Darla, looking over at Prue's parents. Absences? This came from Prue's mother. What absences? Darla fixed her gaze on Prue. You want to tell them? Well, said Prue, looking up from her boots, there have been just a few days. A few days? Sputtered her dad, staring at his daughter in disbelief. A few days where I didn't quite make it in time, and I thought, well, that means I miss homeroom, and if I miss homeroom, that means I won't be ready for world studies, and if I wasn't ready for that, how was I going to manage in math? She waved her hands in front of her face, as if conjuring the disorienting mists of a dense fog. It was like a long line of dominoes falling. I decided to just bag it and read at the coffee shop. Prue's father smiled sheepishly and looked at Mrs. Dennis. At least she's reading, right? His wife ignored the comment. And this domino thing happened on several occasions? She asked, her eyes boring into Prue's bangs, which were now conveniently covering her downcast face. 5, to be precise, answered Miss Dennis. 5? Pronounced Prue's father and mother in unison. 5! Came Mac's voice from the living room. Pooh! 5! Ugh, said Prue. But the truth was that she hadn't been reading at the coffee shop. And she hadn't even really not made it in time to school. The truth was that Prue McKeel, 12 years old, would sometimes wake up in her comfortable bed, in her very comfortable house, with her very comfortable family, and feel a very sudden and very sharp tug. On those days, she'd pull herself out of bed and try her best to go through the repetitions of her daily life to ignore this mysterious tug, but sometimes she'd get as far as her bike and she'd feel compelled to pedal it in the opposite direction of her school. And this tug would be guiding the way. It would tug her down Lombard and tug her past the opening shops and tug her down Willamette and tug her past the college until this strange tug would deposit her, bike and all, on the bluff, overlooking the vast fabric of trees across the river that was the impassable wilderness. And that's where she would spend the better part of the day, just staring at that wide field of green, remembering. On those days, the thought of going to school seemed perfectly out of the question. The snap of a finger. Hello? chimed her mother. I swear, it's like your brain's been abducted by aliens or something. Prue calmly looked at each of the three adults in the eye, one after another. Mom, she said, Dad, Miss Dennis, I'm sorry, Darla. I appreciate you bringing these concerns to my attention, and I'm sorry for any disappointment I might have caused. Excuse me, but I'd like to go on a walk right now. I will meditate on everything you guys have said. And with that, she turned heel and walked out the back door, leaving a flummoxed huddle of grown-ups watching her depart. Here is Chapter 2, Under Wildwood. The Messenger. Another IW. They were an odd assemblage. The two young boys, the two young girls, the large man in a top hat, the skinny bearded man in a dress, and the rat. They stood in a line in the middle of the wide, snow-covered road, watching as two riders approached on horseback. When the riders arrived and had dismounted, the man in the dress stepped forward from the line. Brendan, he said in greeting. He was visibly shivering. The chiffon of his frayed gown rippled in the chill breeze. His posture was hunched, his arms folded across his chest. William, replied the man, serious, nodding a chin that was frosted in a deep tangle of red whiskers. He wore a fairly dirty officer's coat and a pair of riding breeches patched at the knees. A blue-black tattoo snaked up the side of his forehead. He studied the salmon-gowned man for a time before a smirk rolled out across his mouth. The pink, he said, really brings out your eyes. The top-hatted man stifled a laugh. Curtis, standing just behind the bandit William, joined in on the laughter. He was rewarded for this by a penetrating glare from Brendan. Who said this was funny? He shot at Curtis, again serious. The smile abruptly disappeared from the boy's face. A wind had picked up, blowing the remaining flurries of snow sideways across the road, and the little flakes clung obstinately to the fur of Curtis's hat. Henry, William, back to camp. The man in the top hat and the man in the dress scampered away, the latter doing this with some difficulty until he'd hiked the hem of his skirt above his pale, hairy knees. Brendan returned his gaze to the remaining bandits. Calm, mind your horsemanship. You are pushing too hard. You've got to have a better feel for your mount. He held his leather-gloved hands out to model his words. Let up on the reins. Feel the strain of the horse. Only urge on when you've got the power to do so. Aye, Brendan, responded Calm. Now, back to camp. Get ice on that pony's shin. And it's 2 more weeks of horsemanship for you. Brendan watched as the boy jogged away toward a limping horse in the distance. Looking back at the line of 4. Carolyn, solid job. The hard work you've been putting in, it shows. Quite an improvement from last week's drill. As for you, Aisling, he smirked a little. Aisling was the pursuer, had been clotheslined by the cedar bough. There were still bits of twig and moss in her hair, and her face was smeared with tree sap. Not so cocky next time, eh? Aye, Brendan, responded Aisling, chastened. Now back to camp with you. The 2 girls sprinted from the line as if they were running a dash and had just been waiting for the starter pistol. Only Aisling hazarded a look backward. She gave Curtis a quick, reaffirming smile, a moment that he barely had an opportunity to enjoy before the wiry whiskers of Brendan's beard were inches from his forehead. They smelled like wet dog. As for you, began Brendan, drawing out the words in a low growl, as for you, I've lost too many good bandits who made that same move. They think it's all in the bag, everything's taken care of, and bang! His hand, shaped like a pistol and pointed at Curtis's forehead, gave a little recoil. Dead. All because of what? They didn't consider the passenger. They didn't what? They didn't consider the passenger! Right, said Brendan. Biggest mistake you can make. Not only is the passenger just as likely to be armed as anyone, he's likely to be the most dangerous. In my time, I've seen more than one jumped-up banker come out of a carriage with pistols blazing, all panicked, and take out more of his own armed guards than bandits. Never open that door. Don't even approach it till you're sure who's ever inside isn't going to come out fighting. Got it? Yeah, I got it, responded Curtis, nervously adjusting his furry cap. Brendan reached up and gave the Ushanka a firm pat, pushing the brim down over Curtis's eyes. Good, said Brendan, his voice softening. I'd hate to lose our most promising recruit. Curtis beamed. It was the first time he'd heard such praise from the Bandit King during these many weeks of intensive training. It had been hard initially. For some reason, even mounting the pony without nearly toppling sidelong to the ground took a good 2 weeks to master, and Brendan hadn't passed up a single opportunity to hector him for it. But he could feel he was improving. He knew that Brendan did not give such commendations lightly. Septimus cleared his throat. Inserted the rat. What about me? Did you see that move? Straight down his back? Looking down at the rat. Very good, Septimus, but an easy target. You know Henry's squeamish about rodents. He's going to be traumatized for weeks. Septimus cracked his knuckles. It's a joy to have such an effect on a man. The Bandit King laughed before saying, You two will make fine coach robbers, I have no doubt. His voice went steely as he continued, though I can't say that you'll have a chance to practice on the real thing. This much was true. For the past few months, the wrestling parties that had been sent out from the camp had been coming back empty-handed. There were fewer and fewer carriages on the road these days, and those travelers that did brave the frozen path were rarely carrying anything more than a few bushels of dried onions and wilted winter greens. It was severe enough for Curtis to notice. The elder bandits were all grumbling how it had been among the worst dry spells they'd ever seen. They said it was a herald of bad times. The wind picked up, and a new front of falling snow moved through the trees. Winter was in full sway, and the light felt ever dim, even at midday. But now, at the first breath of evening, a dark mist was settling over the branches and obscuring the distant bends of the long road. Brendan shivered in his coat and gestured to the 2 remaining bandits in training. That's enough for today. Let's get back to camp. There are many more points to review, and we have to be ready for tomorrow's... His voice dropped away as they began their walk toward the awaiting horses. Something has caught his attention. He brought up his hand. Hold, he said. Something's coming. Curtis and Septimus froze. They hadn't heard anything. Septimus sniffed the air briefly before scrambling up Curtis's pant-legged coat to arrive at his shoulder. Again he sniffed the air. Bird? He said. Brendan, his hand still in an open palm, nodded. A big one. Suddenly, a crashing noise exploded from the canopy of trees above them, sending a flurry of smaller birds twittering away. A shower of broken branches toppled to the road below. The horses in the road spooked and whinnied. Brendan's hand went instinctively to the saber hilt at his side. Out of the sky fell the crumpled form of something blue and gray and feathered. It slammed into the ground with a pained squawk. A spray of dirt and snow erupted in its landfall. Silence followed. Brendan. "Who's there? Name yourself." The lump of feathers quivered slightly where it lay. Finally, its long neck rose from its body. Finally, its long neck rose from its body like the articulating antenna of a lunar rover, at the top of which was the stately beak of a heron. The bird shook its head and picked at the dirt that had sullied its wing. "Are you okay?" This was Curtis, having recovered from the surprise. The heron's response was unexpected. It was defensive, embarrassed. "I'm fine, thanks," it said acidly. "Just fine." "Who are you?" called Brendan. "And what business do you have in Wildwood, Waterbird?" As if ignoring the Bandit King's demands, the heron took its time pulling its long body from the snow. Curtis was awed by the majesty of the creature. By the time it had bloomed to its full height, it was like a metamorphosis had taken place. What had been a dirty gray lump on the ground was suddenly the towering, graceful form of one of the most striking birds Curtis had ever seen. A long, slender-beaked head topped an S-curved neck that led to a great egg of a body, covered in a long, lash-like white and gray feathers, all supported by two spindly legs. Stretching its neck to its full height to take in its new surroundings, the bird stood easily as tall as Curtis. "My name is Maud," replied the heron finally, "and I've been sent by the Crown Prince of the Avians." The bird swiveled her head back to look directly into Curtis's eyes. "I've come for you, boy. Your friend, the girl McKeel, seems to be in grave danger." By the time the car's wheels had finally left the familiarity of the pavement and began crunching along the wet gravel of the artery road, the passengers had grown silent. Elsie Melberg, 9 years old, fiddled with the shoulder strap of her seatbelt and watched her parents as their faces grew progressively more sallow and concerned. She could tell they were struggling with the decision they'd made, but what choice did they have? Elsie didn't blame them, and while her older sister Rachel had put up more of a fight when the plan was presented to them, in the end she'd begrudgingly agreed. The snow had given way to a heavy, cold rain, and the drops made thick streaks down the car's backseat window, distorting the already imposing metal buildings into bulging and fractured shapes. They'd crossed the boundary into the industrial wastes some time ago. It was a place Elsie'd never been. It was cold and ominous. The rusted white chemical tanks that lined the gravel roads with their winding staircases and wiry trusses of plumbing looked almost science fiction in their otherworldliness. Somewhere deep inside this nest of clattering machinery, she imagined bearded dwarves at work, long removed from the sunshine of the above world. Only instead of broadswords and battle axes, they were making refrigerator doors and motorcycle camshafts. Elsie looked back again to her father in the driver's seat as he navigated the family sedan through the waste's narrow roads. There were filigrees of gray hair at his temples. Elsie was sure they hadn't been there the summer before. And those deep creases that made a kind of canyon landscape on his brow, certainly those were new as well. All since her brother's disappearance. The initial shock had been tremendous. A fog had descended over the house. Whatever joy had previously lived under that roof had all but disappeared, and Elsie hated her brother for it. First had come the police. They squatted down on the living room furniture like elephants in polyester and scribbled down little notes while her mother and father tearfully repeated everything they remembered since the last time Curtis had been seen. Then came the reporters, the news cameramen, the rubbernecking neighbors walking by the picture window and peering in at their broken, desperate family. Finally, Lydia, Elsie's mom, had drawn the curtains to block out the inquisitive, and the windows remained that way for months. The living room, all through the fall, stayed as dark and shadowed as their hearts. Elsie's dad, David, became withdrawn and spent hours on end in his home office, standing vigil on a variety of internet message boards, imploring anyone who would listen to help him find his son. Elsie would sit up night in her bed listening to her parents' hushed conversations in the room next door and would alternately curse her brother and plead for him to return. "Come on, Curtis," she whispered. "Just quit it already. Come home." So when Elsie's dad came running into the kitchen from his office one day, announcing he'd gotten a lead, that someone in Istanbul, Turkey, of all places, had seen a young American boy who fit Curtis's description on the streets of this ancient city, the entire family erupted into a fit of unbridled celebration. It wasn't until they began investigating the cost of the airfare and lodging that it was decided that the two girls, Elsie and Rachel, would have to stay in Portland while the elder Melbergs flew to Turkey to search for their son. And where would the girls stay? Without a suitable family member in town to take them in, the only option was the local orphanage, where, for a reasonable price, a desperate parent could board his or her children for however much time was needed. The Jamesons did it with their kids when they went on that scuba vacation, was all the reassurance the two younger Melbergs were given. And so here they were, slowly winding the labyrinth byways of the industrial wastes to arrive at the Joffrey Unthank Home for Wayward Youth. A neon sign shone through in the dim light ahead of them, advertising as much, with the helpful addendum below it, a flickering string of words that seemed to be at the mercy of a lesser power source and industrial machine parts. Rachel, who'd remained silent for the entire journey, looked up and gasped when the building came into view. Her pale face appeared briefly from between the twin curtains of her long, straight black hair, and her thin shoulders shuddered beneath her threadbare corrosion of conformity t-shirt. "I can't believe this," she said quietly. She fiddled with the little tangle of dark bands that encircled her left wrist. "Now, honey," said Lydia from the front passenger seat, "we've been through this. We just don't have any other options." She craned her head to look at the two girls in the back seat. "Think of it this way. You're doing your part in helping to find Curtis." "Right," responded Rachel glumly. "Whoa," said Elsie, staring ahead through the whisks of the windshield wipers. "That place looks creepy." Silence followed as everyone in the car gave tacit agreement. The gravel drive the car was following finally cleared the rows of windowless metal buildings and chemical tanks to arrive at an open space fenced in by a wall of chain link fence. In the middle of the clearing stood a drab building, seemingly transported to the spot from another era. Its slate-gray stucco walls were stained by lichen and soot, a surface broken regularly by tall mullioned windows. The roof, shale shingles supporting an impressive growth of positively iridescent moss, sloped up to a crest topped by a clock tower. A heavy oak door loomed just beyond a jumble of untidy blackberry bushes. The neon sign pulsated noisily just above this door, a strange modern juxtaposition to the building's decidedly 19th century appearance. A wave of nervousness overcame Elsie, and she reached down between her 2 feet. But a wave of nervousness overcame Elsie, and she reached down between her feet to undo the top zipper of her backpack. From within, she peeked the head of her intrepid Tina doll from the bag and attempted a warm smile. "It's okay, Tina," she whispered. "Everything's going to be just fine." Intrepid Tina was made of hard plastic, and her blonde hair was cropped in a bob at her neck. Elsie snaked her fingers down the back of Tina's beige safari sass outfit to find the little button nub nestled between the doll's shoulder blades. She gave it a push and was calmed to hear the following affirmation, muffled as it was, coming from the little recorder in Tina's chest. "Intrepid girls never shy away from the promise of a new adventure." Tina's voice had a kind of tough rasp to it. Elsie heard her sister sigh and looked over to see that Rachel was watching her askance through the strands of her hair. Elsie waited for a snarky reproach, Rachel's usual response to having been within earshot when Elsie activated Intrepid Tina's voice box, but none came. The situation really was so bad, Elsie thought, that even Rachel was inspired by Tina's words. Easing to a stop in the front of the building, the Melberg's sedan idled for a moment before David turned the key and the engine sputtered into silence. The whistling of the wind, blowing through the corridors between the waste structures, sounded through the car's windows. David craned his head and looked at his 2 daughters in the back seat. "Just 2 weeks," he said, attempting reassurance. "That's all. 2 weeks. And then we'll be back for you." Elsie ran her fingers along the plastic, flaxen hair of Intrepid Tina. 2 weeks had never seemed like a longer span of time in her life.